All right, welcome everybody here in person and online to the Warburg Institute in exile. We are still under construction over at the Institute. We have about 7 or 8 months more of the most disruptive phase where we've lost all of our common spaces, including our much loved lecture room. So we are here in Senate House in the Woburn Suite, which is as close as we can come to being in Woburn Square. And we're very, very happy to have a really great event for you tonight. The book that we are launching and celebrating and hearing about is Ulinka Rublack's fantastic new book, Dürer's Lost Masterpiece. And I just quickly want to say some words of welcome. If you don't know me, I'm Bill Sherman. I'm the director of the Institute. And we were contemporaries in Cambridge, so we go a long way back. But it's such a pleasure to have seen the evolution of Ulinka's work over these last 10, 15 years in particular. And in fact, it feels a bit like a reunion today to have her coming and talking about this particular topic. First, because we did a very wonderful event online during lockdown about the Kepler book that she did about the astronomer and the witch, about his fight for Kepler's mother, and the fiction that emerged by Rivka Galchen that came out a few years ago. And we had a fantastic conversation. But this is actually truly a celebration of Ulinka's own book. But the other part of it that feels a bit like a reunion is this is the dream team from a very memorable episode of In Our Time on Radio 4 back in November 2020. And so we're very happy to have reunited not one, but 3 of the world's leading scholars on Albrecht Dürer. So very happy to have all 3 of you here. Thank you very much for making the time, but above all, thanks to Ulinka for coming here to talk about this book. The additional speakers who are here: Susan Foister, many of you will know, Deputy Director, Director of Collections, Curator of Early Netherlandish, German, and British Painting at the National Gallery. That's 3 big jobs. Plenty to get on with there, but also a great expert on Holbein and on Dürer, as you will hear. And then Giulia Bartrum, a very long and distinguished career in, I think, probably a window we can see from this room across the street in the Prints and Drawings Department at the British Museum, as well as being responsible for a lot of work along the way on cross-departmental provenance research. So very interesting profile. Great book projects on German Renaissance prints and Albrecht Dürer and his legacy, award-winning exhibition catalog. But Ulinka Rublack, the author of the book Dürer's Lost Masterpiece, is, of course, Professor of History at Cambridge and Fellow of the British Academy. You will probably know her, sometimes you probably think, is it the same Ulinka Rublack? Because she really has mastered very different fields of research, very actively recovering the material culture of clothing and fashion some time ago, and building on that, moving as I said, into this extraordinary story about the trial of Johannes Kepler's mother, and now with this extraordinarily detailed and wide-ranging account of Albrecht Dürer in the context especially of mercantile culture and various aspects of the material culture that we'll be talking about and unpacking today. So first and foremost, thank you again and congratulations. Second and foremost, buy the book, because not only is it a very beautiful book, as you can see from one of the copies that's in the room, beautifully produced with color images all the way through, but amazingly, the list price of the book is £30, and you can now get it for £21. So £21 can hardly be better spent, I think, than getting the book. It is already out in England. It comes out in the US in just a few weeks' time. And without further ado, I just want to hand over to Ulinka to tell us a little bit about what she did and why. So it's ready. Is that working yet? I may have to do, oh yeah, good.
Thank you so much for coming tonight and attending online as well. Thank you so much to John Millington from the Warburg for all his work in setting up this event, to Bill Sherman, and of course to Susan Foister and Giulia Bartrum. I'm really honored to be able to benefit from their expertise tonight. So let me very briefly introduce some of the themes of this book. We do think of Albrecht Dürer as an extraordinary printmaker, and right from the beginning of his career, that is, of course, what he did. We see him in this new media revolution, working on the Ship of Fools, and then starting characteristically one of his extraordinary innovations in woodcuts, putting out a number of woodcuts in a book, The Apocalypse. We also think, obviously, of his masterpieces in engraving in 1514, the Melancholia, and his efforts to teach others of how to be better craftsmen, but also better paid craftsmen, by pointing out the mathematical principles of perspective and other considerations to improve their art. And obviously, we all love the rhinoceros, and this ties in with his extraordinary pleasure in seeing curiosity and that new global age he became enmeshed in. But what I am arguing is that we also have to think about Dürer not just as innovator, but as a man who kept stopping doing things. And probably the most extraordinary decision he ever took, I argue, is that he stopped painting altarpieces. Now, why was this so extraordinary? Well, this is the kind of Urscene, the kind of scene of origin for Dürer, which we might have easily forgotten about, because from Panofsky onwards, who said in 1943 that nothing in the history of painting would have changed if Dürer had never taken up a brush. Dürer has been remembered so much as a printer rather than as a painter, with the exception, of course, of his self-portraits, where he comes across often as a rather arrogant man. But the scene at the beginning is this one, that he is trained by his father, who is a goldsmith, and he's already quite advanced in age, and he has a talented son, and he knows the son can take over his workshop. And then the son, age 13, says, I don't want to do this. I want to paint. I've seen the paintings in the churches of Nuremberg, and this is what I want to do. And he says that his father is shocked by this, and finally, he says he relented. So the most ambitious painting you could do at this period were altarpieces. Why? They were large commissions for which you got paid quite a chunk of money. And they were very complex paintings to work on then for over a longer period of time. And this is what he wanted to do, and this is how he wanted to make his name until, and that is the story I tell in the book, Jakob Heller, a Frankfurt merchant, brought him to the edge of a nervous breakdown. So how did Heller achieve that? Heller was a merchant patron who did something quite extraordinary. And the way I'm trying to tell that story, based on the extraordinary fact that we have 9 extant letters, which of course doesn't sound like a great deal for this period is so precious, 9 letters from Dürer to Heller. So I want to tell the story from both sides. Heller did something quite extraordinary for a merchant. He asked a very contemporary artist to do an altarpiece for him. So Dürer got so frustrated, and that story is at the heart of the first part of the book, in that relationship, and we're going to explore it more, I think, in what we're going to talk about together, through negotiating the price of this painting, through trying to argue what it really means to do a painting, what the process of painting involves, teaching this man what it means not just to receive a product, but actually to understand the process behind painting and why he loves doing it. So this led, in my view, to huge frustration on Dürer's part. And you may have noticed this, what he did then, at the background, central background, no artist before or after did ever anything again on a religious painting to be hung in a church, was to include a figure of himself. And here you have a little extract from one of the letters where he is voicing his frustration about being paid relatively little for what he wants to be an extraordinary, therapeutic, spiritual, and beautifully painted piece. So after this painting that was to be done for the Dominican convent chapel, monastery in Frankfurt, he painted only this altarpiece that he'd already committed to, very different commission, very small scale, little place for impoverished craftsmen, actually, in Nuremberg, that would have hardly been seen. But the Halle altarpiece, until the early 17th century, was, I think, and I hope you'll agree, Dürer's most prominent painting available to audiences who went to the fairs and then paid to see this altarpiece being opened up. So you might by now think, well, I've never seen this. And of course, the title of the book is The Lost Masterpiece. So the story then continues that in the early 17th century, in 1614, Maximilian I of Bavaria sets everything in his power to get this painting out of the Dominican monastery. This is, of course, a very interesting story that I tell, the culture of the copy, the culture where collectors start to take things, originals out of religious houses and replace them with a copy. So what you see here is then that the original burned in the early 18th century, the original Dürer, and this is a quick copy that was done by a good student of Dürer's hand, but not a master himself, as you can see. And this is now in Frankfurt's Historical Museum, and the only trace of what I do think was a masterpiece. So very briefly, at the end of his life, Dürer is in Antwerp in 1520, 1521. And he becomes a collector of curiosities. And you might be familiar with a quote about the feather headdresses he sees that Cortez brought over. And he says famously that he's never seen anything as splendid as those. He's astonished by Aztec craftsmanship. And the rest of the book really tells also a story where Dürer from 1550 onwards certainly is actually not that well known other than through his prints in the German lands and through the Halle altarpiece. And of course, this is now the new culture of the culture of curiosities, where merchants again are driving new tastes of interest in shells and in whole cabinets of curiosities. This is a collector, Wilhelm of Bavaria, who puts up by 1580 the first purpose-built house for these curiosities in the German lands. And I just want to show you again, these extraordinary surviving artifacts that we really have to address, and that's what I want to end with and open up for the discussion. Have to understand, of course, through the question about value. So how, as historians and art historians, can we understand what societies value as art? What are the contexts for these new valuations? Who forges them? and why? And when does a consensus about what is to be valued as art break down? So these are some of the larger issues that my book explores, and the whole question of what social behaviors attach to art as well. But also I celebrate the Dürer who dare to stand up in the name of craft for to a merchant like Jakob Heller. And I think that question hasn't gone away either. It's a question for all of us. So what do we define as craft? What is art? And how much are we prepared to pay for it?
Thank you. Susan, you want to jump in with some comment?
Yeah.
Bring this down here so it's a bit easier to hear.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Well, I think there's so much to comment on, so much to discuss. I mean, it's such a very, very rich book, and I've immensely enjoyed reading it and thinking about it. I wanted to come back to the idea of Dürer as a painter, and the questions that arise from his dialogue in his letters to Heller that you analyze. And he talks a lot, and I think one of the things that interested me is that, you know, there's a lot in the rest of the book about people bargaining for this and that, and about merchant culture in the 16th and 17th century. Mm-hmm. But you set up this dialogue that Dürer has in the surviving letters with Jakob Heller, a kind of dialogue that echoes through, you know, 2 centuries afterwards. I mean, he is using those terms of bargaining and valuing, and that emerged for me extremely clearly. What I wanted to sort of just start maybe thinking about was this idea of, you know, how fast or how slowly you painted in this period and what that actually means. I mean, were artists valued if they painted extremely quickly? I mean, you point, of course, to the Christ and the Doctors painting that we actually had in the National Gallery exhibition here a couple of years ago. People may have seen it there. It's usually in the Thyssen collection. I mean, he says on that, it's the work of 5 days, but I don't think anybody really ever believes that. So he seems to be really addressing this idea that to be a great artist, you have to work at top speed. And then in the letters about the altarpiece, he's saying, I've got to slow this down tremendously. I cannot do this fast. It's going to take me a tremendously long time. And I mean, you hint that, you know, are we really to believe him when he says he's painting fast? Are we really to believe him when he says he has to paint so slowly? I mean, is any of this really sort of credible, or is it all, it's part of performance, isn't it, about what it means to be an artist?
Yes, absolutely. So do you think I should answer?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so that goes to the heart of why these are actually quite difficult sources to interpret. And you know, I really would like the readers to make up their own minds in part, you know, as to where they think he's strategic and where he's actually quite authentic and truthful about the process and his hopes for the process for him. And I think we see him also shifting in his ideas. So absolutely, you know, we know from Cranach, who of course is his contemporary and perfects his factory style to, you know, really turn out the pieces ever faster, that this is a very different model. And Dürer tries to absolutely, we actually don't know enough at all about his workshop. You know, there are very different ideas about his workshop setup and how much he did work in workshops. And he does want to project himself very much as an independent painter in Nuremberg. And in that sense, of course, totally unusual for the time as someone not linked to a court. So, he clearly in Venice, he boasts about the time he thinks he can finish things in. And yet he's also describing these processes, which we know materially, just from the drying times, just from, you know, what it means to work on that scale, that it can't be done very fast. And you do have to have other projects alongside it, but, you know, it does take its time. Yeah.
Julie, do you want
Yeah.
to jump in? Yeah.
I come from the opposite point of view in a way, because I've worked in prints and drawings my whole career, and I've always seen Dürer first and foremost as a printmaker, which we all have known and accepted, but a very extraordinary one at that. He completely revitalized a market that, well, actually created one that simply didn't exist. And I do think there is an argument, he says somewhere in his letters that, all this aggro that he's getting with Hello, that he would be better off going back to his prints. But having said all that, I think that's always at the back of his mind. And also, when he finished with the Hello piece, he was immediately sucked into Maximilian's huge paper projects, which again reflects back to his extraordinary ability in creating that market for prints, large scale, incredible prints. I mean, Maximilian, was extraordinary in deciding that he was going to commemorate, and he's also rather broke, we must remember that, but he was going to commemorate his dynasty with huge paper projects. I mean, that was a really quite a step at the time. And I think Dürer himself got very much sucked into that because it did feed into his creative side. I think he got slightly frustrated by Maximilian's demands and Maximilian's sort of constant, but that in a way doesn't take away from any of this, because the wonderful thing about this book is that every time we put on an exhibition here about Europe, particularly outside Germany, it's always got a fairly linear story to tell. We focus on his life, always travelled. I mean, we have to. We're trying to show the best of him. We're trying to show him to an audience that really doesn't understand him in the same way that it's in German. I've always said, when I did the Dürer exhibition in 2002, I said, you just have to think that Dürer is in Germany like Shakespeare is here. We don't have that sort of visual. So you have to sort of go back to square one. But in that, you lose the incredible depth which you've drawn out in this. The background, the focus on the costume, the colours, the status of the furs that they're wearing, the types of ties and dyes and pigments and inks, which make the most wonderful story of just seeing it in a much more rounded way. And I can see from what put into this is all. A lot of it's all there, but as in many cases, the best types of research, it's a matter of pulling together all those threads, archives and documents, and knowing where to look in different sources and just matching them together to create a story, to create a really believable story of how Dürer lived and who he worked with. So that I think is the most, and also going into the legacy period, which by focusing on the Hello piece, which is a great story in itself. But just to go back to the prints again, I would like to just say, from the material side, he was most definitely as interested in paper, the construction of paper, for the different types of works that he did. You show a few drawings here. They're very, very, very different. For this one, Melancholia, it certainly seems now, and certain research done recently on his 3 master engravings, as they're called, Melancholia, Night, Death and the Devil, and St. Jerome in his study, that Dürer intentionally picked very fine papers, very smooth papers with no watermarks visible, which is quite a big ask. Must have taken some sort of sourcing. Equally, his prints, such as the rhinoceros, were much thicker, robust paper because it went through big, huge print runs. So you needed something quite different. There's quite a lot of information we can now draw together about the dates of these things and how long the blocks lasted. So again, that goes back to the material side. We could learn so much about the watermarks, which again have been recorded, but no one's kind of put together that information. So it's certainly clear too that he had a connection with the Fuggers. You focus on the later Fugger after his life, but Dürer commissioned or bought a substantial stash of paper with the Fugger trade emblem in it. It has a trident and a little circle, which used a very, very thin paper, and he used it specifically, really, for many of his drawings where they were double-sided, that he could use to make sketches which are double-sided. And it seems that this paper was made initially for Fugger as a trademark to to record things he was used for his account books. This is the early part of the Prince family before they had their own documents.
Maybe I can add here that we're part of a new research network that's managed from Manchester in Melbourne. That is called Materializing Dürer.
Yeah.
And I think this is really where it's at, and what I'm trying to do in my book already. That we do need to think not just, of course, of the merchant milieu that he was part of. Absolutely, I mean, his best. You do feel that many of the people he found most exciting, absolutely, were the merchants and those involved in the Atlantic trade. Who kept bringing up these novelties that delighted him and for which he created new words. Like, for instance, Dürer is the one who creates the word shell line in German, Muschellinie. So it's all coming together. Seeing the objects and creating ideas from it. And of course these are about spirals, so mathematical propositions from it. But also I make the argument that we have to rematerialize humanism. Famously, his one of his very close friends is Willibald Pirkheimer, and humanism this period has been seen very much in relation to texts, and then of course also through the materiality of print, but it absolutely goes beyond that. So when Pirkheimer writes to Dürer in Venice. They never talk about aesthetic theory. I mean, never asked him really, it seems, about his painting. All he wants, like a shopping list. He just wants lots. I mean, also some Greek books, but otherwise lots and lots of objects. And we know exactly what Pirkheimer's, interior looked like. Again, very few paintings, interestingly, or prints, but lots of stag antlers, interestingly. But more importantly, for this, my attempt to rematerialize the process of paint is that what we actually find is that in Nuremberg at the time, people are absolutely obsessed with alchemy, with little laboratories where they make cosmetics. Men make cosmetics. They collect recipes, ancient recipes. They all want to dye their hair, and they all want to recommend their lady friends cosmetics. So, it's part of that alchemical interest that, of course, is also then full of spiritual ambition to find healing oils, to find healing images. And that really, I argue, is the new humanist and mercantile world that Dürer needs to be recontextualized into.
When I jump in and offer my own kind of overriding question, which comes out of a number of things you've said, but also particularly the fantastic use in the book of the monogram as a sort of running divider, section divider. It's one of the most known, recognizable aspects for Dürer, as well as here we are. I guess as well as just this question of how he presents himself in such a conspicuous, such an unusual way, and I think it made me think of my colleague Brian Cummings from University of York, my colleague there, who tried to make a case to me that Erasmus was the first author who was recognizable by his visual image. And in fact, there was a fantastic catalog and exhibition about visual representations of this great author. And he said, really, he was the first celebrity author in a way. And I'm very struck by some of the similarities in what you're presenting, particularly in the early parts of his career. And again, it may be obvious, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what he's doing that's unusual vis-a-vis authorship or the career of the artist.
Mm.
Thank you.
So he absolutely grows up in this very commercially minded print center in Nuremberg. His own father, he tries to make him sound humble, but his father, like all the other middling craftsmen, they're all invested in mines elsewhere in Germany. So that is the setup, and he's very intent on copywriting his monogram, which is of course about the door. So Dürer as in the Dora, we might say. So that is what you see as a visual pun here. However, while that is absolutely true, that he's quite pioneering in this and successful. I mean, Dürer was one of the richest men in Nuremberg when he died, and this is interesting precisely because he did not. It seems he was infertile. He did not have children. In fact, the family pretty much died out with him. So there was no reason really to try to make money just in the way they evidently did want to make money. But for him, this is about recognition. It's about how he wants to be seen as an artist and how he wants to be paid. But at the same time, we also have to be a little bit careful. So, it's often thought that the 1500 extraordinary self-portrait and these three self-standing portraits in oil. And of course, he identifies himself on the last one in particular, are pointing to him as a bit of a show-off. So much so that in the Anglo-American sphere, he is often now written, I think, of a little bit as arrogant, which was refreshing to me in the sense, I mean, you said the German discourse is, of course, one of reverence. I mean, I do remember a friend of mine asking me, who's an art critic, asking me when I was writing the book early on, she asked me, do you like Dürer? And I was I just could not cope with that question. I mean, growing up in Germany, when I did, I mean, it had not ever occurred to me that you might not like Dürer. I mean, so I think I understand the question better now, having worked more on it and really seeing his the complexity of his mindset and what shaped it. But at the same time, it also needs to be said that the Munich self-portrait, where he shows himself Christ-like, we now really think that he always kept it in his own studio, that it was very likely done for to get more commissions in portraiture. Again, it was not the case that the people of Nuremberg or otherwise were flocking to him and showering him at that point with commissions at all around 1500. And that is why, when he's in 1506, he's already in his mid-30s, he's in Venice, and he needs a loan from Pirkheimer to even be able to work there. So when he arrives at this interchange with Heller, it is really, I mean, he wants to buy a house, but he can only buy this house if he gets paid decently. So that is, he is really having to fight this fight. He feels very responsible for feeding his family. So I do think we need to recover also a lot of that complexity of his situation.
It seems to me that there's a bit of a tension between the way in which he wants to keep his painting very much as something that is always unique and made by himself only, with himself inserted into it, just in case you were in any doubt, and the way that he starts up this sort of one-man print industry in which everything's replicated again and again and again. Yeah. And that sort of tension, I think, comes over quite clearly in what you're writing about as well. And I think it's interesting in view of the amount then that he is copied. I mean, I think both in terms of the prints, which I think, Giulia, you showed very well in your exhibition, and then later in terms of some of the paintings, as you write about as well. Whether you want to,
maybe Giulia wants to add on. Or maybe I can say a little bit about a term that might be familiar to you is the Dürer Renaissance. So the Dürer Renaissance describes a process where after this time. From around 1550, he dies obviously in 1528, and then there's a period where he becomes lesser known, or known mostly through his prints. And so that we have the collection, for instance, of this great connoisseur in the German lands, Wilhelm of Bavaria, the Bavarians driving their prominence in the Holy Roman Empire to become one of the electors of the emperor. through the medium of art collecting. So in this cabinet of curiosities that is put up as this purpose-built building in Munich in the 1570s, for instance, there's a Dürer, but it's not labeled. So that is very, very characteristic of this phase. And then the Dürer Renaissance is associated with the emperor, then Rudolf II in Prague, who is the one who then has a separate cabinet of curiosities and an art gallery. And there starts to be that craze for old master paintings. And in particular, Maximilian, so the son of Wilhelm, starts to become this major bidder. So because he doesn't know how many Dürers there are in Germany, paintings, he really starts this extraordinary search across the German lands to find out whether they are still in some churches he might know about, and to turn that into a private art gallery. So what I'm arguing is twofold there. On the one hand, this is undeniably a re-evaluation of Dürer's painting. Then he becomes very famous again. But why? So here I try to understand that point, we might say, with Alfred Gell of trying to understand how social behavior is linked to art social connoisseurship. So what, in fact, Maximilian likes about Dürer is that he describes his paintings as clean, and he describes them as neat, and he describes Dürer as hardworking. And if you know anything about Maximilian of Bavaria, who's driving war, who's driving with great efficiency new politics to gain prominence in the politics, you know about him that he's exactly those three things. Maximilian is neat, extremely sober, and he's hardworking. So it is actually, so it's not the inventive Dürer that is valued here. It is as if it's a mirror image of himself that Maximilian likes. And the second argument I make about that Dürer Renaissance is that it's often then thought is that these men collectors return to painting, but alongside they absolutely also still collect other things. Of course, they collect books about gardens, and they garden at great expense. So one example is this extraordinary book that is probably Wilhelm of Bavaria's copy in a treasure of the British Library. And the whole project costs 18,000 gulden by 1613. So an enormous amount of money this bishop, in this case, an art lover, pays to have the first time that a garden is commemorated in print. Yeah, so these projects and the buying of shells, etc., of course, run alongside that evaluation of painting.
Giulia, do you want to say anything about drawing as another crucial medium here that we haven't really touched on yet?
Drawings and the prints played a particularly dramatic part in so-called Dürer Renaissance. I've just, recently been trying to argue it's less Dürer Renaissance, which of course means rebirth. It's just as a Dürer revival, in which the high point was really the court of Rudolf II in Prague, because Dürer and his impact never went away. He was always incredibly sought after. In print and in drawing too. The Imhoffs in Nuremberg did a very, very good job of promoting Dürer, of commissioning Hans Hofmann to make precise, very beautiful drawings by Dürer, some of which were sold as, it's debatable, some of which were sold as Dürer, some of which he put Hans Hofmann on them, but they are absolute replica copies. So there was the admiration of Dürer was at such a point, and this is in the 1580s, that you could see an image and know it was by Dürer, even though you realised it was someone else actually drawing it. And I noted that there was a point in Karl Amanda's biography when I was looking at that recently, where Dürer at that point, so early 17th century, was so famous, he said, I don't need to list out his prints here, they're so well known. So there was an acceptance that his work was just overall the one to emulate. And this is certainly the case in Antwerp, which became the centre of really the trade in terms of mercantile trade that we're talking about. What happened to the printmaking overall is that Antwerp took over, and their artists trained, notably the Wierix family, they trained by copying Dürer's prints endlessly. The detailed Dürer's prints was so important. Again, sometimes signing them as Wierix, sometimes just leaving the AD monogram on them. And there are instances when Dürer's drawings, which were equally well known within the collecting circle, were used to produce prints. Bits of drawings were taken from them. And that would have happened in sort of that was 1560 or so, the particular instance I'm thinking of. So it was almost as though the Maximilian of Bavaria was creating a cabinet of curiosities in which Dürer played a part, and everything else was included, as was Rudolph. And I think it reached a point where there's a sort of competition between the different courts within the home, whatever you go, well, I can do better than that, and I can, and they never stop. But as far as Dürer was concerned, they never stopped going back to Nuremberg and looking to the Impost primarily to supply a copy, a derivation, or whether there's some more Dürer drawings actually stayed with the family, which they did quite a while after his death, but were still being released. So it was so, he made such an impression, whether through the paintings such as this, but also through his prints and the drawings that were known, his style, that as I say, that reputation just grew and grew towards the end of the 16th century.
Can I just jump in with one more maybe final prompt for the three of you to reflect on, because I think you'll all have something to say about it, and then maybe we can have some questions from the audience here and online. And it's really to move from this 16th century frame where, of course, we've talked about German, Bavarian, Dutch. The historiography that you're touching on becomes quite an English, surprisingly English story. And I guess I want to ask a little bit about Dürer's place in English historiography and museology. What does he mean here? Now, Holbein's a comparable case, but quite different. And having, all of you in England done now quite a lot for our understanding and appreciation of Dürer, I just wonder if you want to reflect a little bit on the national question about the place where he sits now.
Julia, do you want to start? Or Susan?
I'm reflecting on that.
Yeah, sure. No, but I was I'm very struck in your sources and in your footnotes. Again, given especially your background, the fact that you were trained, at first in art history in A.B. Warburg's own Hamburg and lived on his own street. And yet it's quite an English book in many ways, referring to a lot, for me, a shocking amount really of English materials. I just wonder if you've reflected on that yet. You end with a walk through Bloomsbury in the book.
I do.
And so it is a very English frame.
Yeah.
In fact, you walk to that building out of that window at the end of the book.
And of course, I'm German and British now.
Right.
In terms of nationalities, but it is so that one thing to say, which is that it needs to be perhaps treasured more, that London has the most extraordinary holdings of the drawings, the sketches, more than and his writings. So they're in the British Library. Then we have extraordinary print resources in the British Museum. And then his father is in the National Gallery. So he really is part of this heritage here. Of course, the reason he is, I lay this out in the last part of the book, is because of the 30 Years' War. Part of it is really, it's absolutely in terms of provenance, a slightly untold story. advantageous buying, but then it was bought, and the profiteers in Germany did exactly the same. So. But still, this is why the problematic side of this is absolutely, we should perhaps quickly talk about this, is Brexit. So it's absolutely, of course, we know why these volumes of his writings and so on came to the British Library and they're digitized and so on. But it's also true that, of course, now for German researchers to come here and get a visa to work here more extensively is extremely hard. So I think herein lies the problem for research nowadays, that it is all, that has become so cumbersome, and that shouldn't be the case, especially given that story of the provenance. But your question is about methodologies. And I do think the material turn was spearheaded here and in America, and that has been intellectually very much my home. And my home has also been really the pioneering cooperation that was possible here between academics and museum teachers and curators and conservators, which still nowadays is beginning to happen a bit more in Germany, but it's very different. So the fact that the Victoria and Albert Museum had a research department, the fact that there were constantly exhibitions in London where I would be inspired and learn from, the fact that we had many workshops with Martha Archmar, who's here tonight, and many others. We've been talking together for a very long time and on the same page. And the National Gallery was pioneering research on the process of analyzing the painting and what they're made of. All of this has provided me with an intellectual atmosphere in which I could rethink and materialize Dürer.
Well, perhaps I can just add a little bit from the sort of museum point of view, from the paintings in the National Gallery and their history, which I've just been writing about. I mean, Dürer, along with Holbein, provide names that never go out of fashion really in Britain. They are the names that everybody knows, and they are the names that everybody hoped to be able to associate with paintings that came into the National Gallery's collection. Didn't always go very well. There were a number of it's quite easy to fake a Dürer because of the monogram. So, there were paintings that were acquired in the 19th century with Dürer monograms. They weren't Dürers, and people were always hopeful. Holbein, of course, wasn't a German. He was an honorary Brit, so we didn't really have to worry about him so much. I think, with Dürer, Dürer's father is a very interesting case study that we've discussed before, talked about with Giulia particularly. That was a painting that the gallery acquired in 1900 as a Dürer, but we now think is not by Dürer, although the history, as you refer to in the book, is so interesting because it does seem to have been in Nuremberg Town Hall and given to the Earl of Arundel, to be given to Charles I, and it absolutely was the painting that went to Spain with the authentic self-portrait now in the Prado, although the evidence for that has really only just emerged because we can now actually find the inventory number that's painted on the front of our picture in the Prado inventory. So we know it was there, but it is not an authentic Dürer, and that's such an interesting story. We haven't time here even to go into the story of the Dürer's workshop painting of the Virgin and Child, acquired as a genuine Dürer in 1945. So, the history of Dürer in the National Gallery and in Britain, I think, is a history of a name and a reputation, but the works don't always go along with that. We've got lots of Dürers.
It just goes back to the 18th century. Our collection comes from Hans Sloane, and it was his. There are four volumes in the British Library, which contain writings and sketches for his books that he worked on later in life. And then there's a whole volume of drawings, which was bound in black and stamped in gold AD, with the date 1637, which we now believe goes back to a great Swedish collector, Spearing and Silverkrona. It took a long time to really identify who this man was, but again, it's a question of a early 17th century collector. So things were leaking out of Nuremberg from really the end of the 16th century, early 17th century that was the point when these collections formed in terms of drawings, almost drawings. And he was Silverkrona was advised Queen Christina of Sweden, had a big collection himself, all bound uniformly in these black leather volumes, and quite a lot of work has been done retracing his collection. And at the same time, Thomas Howard, the Earl of Arundel, was putting together his collection, which of course ended up in the UK. But it's I think also it's to do here, thinking of how things worked out in the UK, is to do the sort of very centralised way that England works. I mean, London just happens to have the main collections, in Germany, and of course Austria. So they have fantastic collections, but it's all dispersed in a different vendor, and they don't have the same way of communicating with each other. The rate that things are put online has varied hugely. I mean, much more has been done now. But if you look at the collections in Berlin and Dresden together, and indeed in volumes in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, there are great collections of Dürers across Europe. But it's just that the way they could be studied here, and I think that goes back to the Warburg Institute too.
Yeah.
That's to do with the history, 19th century history of art history, so presented here in London, has enormously fostered this huge focus on studies of this area here in London.